Hi guys, this is DJ, and this week we're going to be covering what we missed in class last week, and that's the economics of elasticity. So let's go ahead and get right to it. Before we get to started in the material itself, I want to take a moment and go over last week's quiz. Now I'll be returning your papers to you here momentarily to start the next class. But I want to take a moment to go over the results of the answer to the quiz to make sure everybody's on the same page with it. So we're going to go a little bit out of order on this, and we're going to make sure that we handle the toughest stuff last. So let's get right to it. First question, what does Tonstoffel mean? Well, it's pretty straightforward. It means there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Now, this quote is designed to really get you thinking like an economist, and it's designed to make you think about things in terms of who benefits, who's paying for it, and where is it being given to you? What is the person who's giving it to you seeking to get out of it? Because no matter what you get, no matter where it comes from, there is always a process in place to create the good or service that is in question. In particular, I'm reminded of social media services like Facebook or Twitter that are ostensibly offered to you free of charge. But when it comes to things like this, there's an old saying that goes, if you're not paying for it, you're not the customer, and if you're not the customer, you're the product. And in social media, that's very much a true statement, because what's happening is that even though you're using their product for free, they have advertising that they're paid for by companies that are trying to sell you goods and services. And in turn, the social media companies like Facebook and Twitter are tracking your data to find out exactly what your habits are like, to sell that data to the companies who are trying to sell you goods and services to make their marketing campaigns more effective. So keeping this phrase in the back of your mind is just a good rule of thumb when it comes to life, because it always gets you thinking about things in terms of cost and benefit. So that's all I want you to get from this particular phrase. Question number 3. Which of these statements is normative? We either have government increases in tax rates cause people to spend less, or that the government should lower tax rates so people can buy more. Well, of these two, the second statement is normative. Normative statements have to do with what ought to be or what we think should happen, as opposed to what actually is and can be proven through science and an application of proven theory. And so in this course, we will be dealing more or less strictly with positive statements like the first one. We want to take the theory and apply it to situations to talk about what will happen. Now, just like anybody, we all have our own biases, and it's natural that those can come through in the way that we view the world. However, as scientists, we want to take a look at things from a purely positive standpoint and talk about what we can show will happen through data and through application of proper theory, and then leave the should discussion to, other situations. So between the two of these, the second one is normative. Normative is talking about should, positive talks about is, and in this course we will be focusing primarily on what is. Next question. Who is the mastermind at iPencil? Now, there was some discussion in the quiz answers about who these people might have actually been, because there was someone who said that the federal government ought not to be, I believe the answer was. But we're talking about who is explicitly said to be the mastermind in iPencil. And the answer is E, none of the above, because we can actually point to a passage like this, although there are several. And when we're looking at this particular passage, it says that there's an absence of a mastermind, that there's no one dictating or forcibly directing these countless actions which cause this creation, or which cause the creation of a pencil. And so when we're looking at this, it's really about thinking about how all the different production processes go into the creation of the simplest of objects, and indeed it's relatively inexpensive. I mean, we're not going to go and pay much more than a few cents for a given pencil. I mean, unless it's a very really fancy one, you're buying it in a set. But generally, for your basic number 2 pencil, you're paying what, 5 cents, 15 cents, something like that when you buy them in packs. And so there's these countless productive processes and learning processes and skill gatherings and resource gatherings that are going on behind the scenes that are going on each of their own volition. Well, the processes themselves are not of their own volition, but people conducting these of their own volition. They're gaining these skill sets independently from one another. But still, all these processes, even though they can be conducted independently of one another, come together to create a relatively complex product and offer that to a relatively low cost. And again, the passage itself talks about the invisible hand that was spoken about more explicitly by Adam Smith, who is said to be the father of modern economics and by a lot of scholars. But still, this is just a question about the reading and also getting you thinking about how all the processes come together seemingly without a single mastermind directing the process. How as we said before, referencing Hayek's work, there's a kind of spontaneous order that arises out of the chaos. Alright, so question number 2, and this was the hard one. Which of these will not cause a shift in the demand curve for the market of potato chips? And the answer is A, a change in the price of potatoes. So let's talk about this. I've got a lot of variation in the answers on this, so it makes me think that we need to talk about this a little bit more. Let's go through the other answers in turn and see why they would cause a shift in the demand curve for the market of potato chips. So option B, a change in the price of sour cream for dips. Well, let's go back to the determinants of demand. When we talk about determinants of demand, we're talking about the difference between a shift in the demand curve, so a shift in D, versus a simple change in quantity demanded, which would be movement along the demand curve. And we know the determinants are taste and preferences, income, the number of buyers, price of related goods, or expectations. And so when we're looking at this last question, it's easy to understand that the price of sour cream for dips, that if the change in the price of sour cream will cause a change in the price of dips, dips for potato chips can be considered a related product. They would be considered a complement because chips and dip go together. And so since that would be a related a change in the price of a related good, we can assume that there would be a change or a shift in the demand curve for potato chips. Now, before we go too much farther into this, let's take a moment to discuss more what we mean by a shift in the demand curve. Last week, we constructed a demand curve using a demand schedule, which is a fancy term for a table showing the with one column of price per quantity and another column with quantity demanded at that price. And so in essence, it's a table showing the relationship between price and quantity demanded for a given good at a particular time and scope. When we simply change the price of the good, that's movement along the table. That's simply going to a different price on the table, but the relationship between the price and quantity demanded does not change. In order for us to have a shift in the demand curve, there must be a structural shift in the relationship between price and quantity demanded. That is, the amount of quantity that you would purchase at a single given price will change one way or another. And so that's what we are talking about when we say a shift. So bringing that into the case of our price of sour cream for dips, if say the price of sour cream goes down, people are going to say, oh, hey, I can get more dip for chips at a lower price, so I'm going to go ahead and get some more of that. Well, we've got more dip now we want to have more chips, and so people are going to buy more chips even though the prices of chips have not changed. And so what we see is a structural change in the way that the graph a movement in the curve itself. Because even though we didn't have a change in price, people are buying more chips because the price of another good changed. Moving on to C, we see a similar effect, except it goes in the opposite direction. So when we talk about a change in the price of corn for corn chips, that's going to imply a change in the price of corn chips itself, and corn chips can be reasonably assumed to be a substitute for potato chips. So the thinking on this would be is that, and going back to our demand determinants, we can see that substitutes have an inverse relationship as opposed to a direct relationship like complements. A direct relationship here means that the two will move together. Substitutes means they move in opposite directions. So as the price of corn chips goes up, people will start purchasing more potato chips because they'll get more bang for their buck with potato chips. And even though the price to price of potato chips has not really changed, people will buy more potato chips, which will cause a rightward shift in the demand curve. People will buy more potato chips even though the price hasn't changed. And if there are any questions about that, we can go over it again at the start of class this coming week. And so finally, the last thing we have here is a weather report forecasting a drought in Idaho. Well, the next thing we have here are expectations. Expectations we covered in class will change or cause a shift in a demand or supply curve. The reason being that if you anticipate a change in available supply or available demand in the future, you may end up purchasing more now in order to make sure you have some available in the future. We might call this a hoarding effect. So say we've got a drought coming in Idaho, and we anticipate that in the future the price of potato chips will be much higher than it is right now. We might turn around and go and buy some extra potato chips now, put them aside so that we can have them at the current lower price when it comes time to consume them and the prices are higher. So expectations can cause a change in the relationship between price and quantity demanded. And so you might be saying to me, well, wait a second, we saw somewhere in one of those tables or one of those lists that input prices will change the relationship in a curve. And that is true, but it does not shift the demand curve. A good's own price does not shift the demand curve. It simply moves along the table between different prices. It does not cause a structural change in the relationship between price and quantity demanded. We do have a price of inputs causing a shift, but that has to do with supply, not demand. Input prices are a determinant of supply, not demand. So when we have the determinants of supply, if we see a change in input prices, that will cause a shift in the supply curve, not demand. So when we go back to our question, we can see that a change in the price of potatoes, even though they are an input for potato chips, since they would be an own price, they would not cause a shift in the demand curve for the market of potato chips. I hope that's clear, and I'll be happy to answer any questions about that with class on Monday. Again, we'll be going through all this material, and if you do have any questions about it, because it does get kind of math heavy, please bring them to class and I'll be happy to answer them then. We'll have a brief period of review at the start of class this coming Tuesday. Alright, so we covered that. So let's go ahead and get started into the new material. Before we get to the math of it, what I wanted to do was to go ahead and there is one more thing I wanted to cover. Last week we had a question about there was a question about the relationship between substitutes and the price of related goods determining supply. And I did a little further research on it, and I got a good example for you guys. So when we're talking about complements, there's a direct relationship. Price of related goods supplied. Going back to our example with potato chips, say that there is a increase in the price of dip, as we said before. It's still a direct relationship, because what will happen is, as the price of the complement goes up, the suppliers of potato chips, in seeing this, will say, hey, people are going to be buying more of our potato chips. We can capture more profit. And so we're going to start producing more to capture more goods at that higher rate, because we think people are going to be purchasing more than they would before at the same price. So again, what we see is a structural shift in the supply curve, even though the price itself may not change of the good we're talking about, which is potato chips. But for substitutes actually have an inverse relationship, as producers will shift production to goods with higher prices or greater profits. And the example I have for you guys on this is to think about a vegetable garden. Like, you've got a garden out back, or say you're a farmer and you grow row crops for profit. You just turn around and sell them on the open market. Let's say you're in Illinois, South Illinois, or parts of Iowa, and you're a pretty normal corn and soy farmer. Well, on a given year, you can either plant corn or you can plant soybeans. And what will happen is that if the price of let's say you were planning on planting corn this year, but the price of soybeans is expected to go up. Soybeans is a substitute, because you can only plant one thing on a given plot of land. It can either be corn or it can be soybeans. But if the price of soybeans goes up, then you have an incentive to start planting more soybeans, because you'll get a higher price for the same unit of land. And so substitutes still have an inverse relationship, as you will shift production away. So instead of producing corn, since soybeans will give you a higher price per the inputs, you'd plant more soybeans instead. So I wanted to point this out, since we mentioned it briefly and I said I'd get back to you on that. So I hope this is clear. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know. So let's go on to the new material. I mentioned own price earlier, and this seems kind of self-explanatory, but I wanted to bring it up and describe it to you, because we're going to be saying this a lot, and I want it to be clear of what we're talking about. Because while own price itself is pretty obvious, other things that are different from own price start getting a little bit questionable, and so we want to make sure we have a solid foundation here. So the own price is the price of the good in question. Again, going to our market for potato chips, the price of potato chips is the product's own price. Pretty straightforward. Cross prices occur when we're talking about a related good, something that, or a different good in regards to the same market, either a complement, substitute, or unrelated. So we could, in talking about the market for potato chips, we could be talking about the price of dips, the price of corn chips, or the price of tea in China. What does that have to do with potato chips? Not a thing, or at least very little. And finally, we're going to be talking, and this is the big concept we're going to be covering in this lecture, is price elasticity. And this is a big definition, but when we think about it, it's very simple. The definition is that it is the percent magnitude of responsiveness in quantity demanded or supplied when exposed to a shock in price. Again, that's lots of jargon, and it's a complete definition, but when we think about it, the concept becomes very simple. So let's kind of talk about that for a moment. In the last class, we saw the development of supply and demand, and we saw that supply and demand is determined by a relationship between the price and the quantity, or the price per quantity, and the quantity supplied or demanded. We saw that shifts in supply and demand occur when that relationship changes. Now we need to be able to speak about that relationship itself more generally. And so when firms are setting prices for goods and services, they need to be able to consider how consumers will respond. There are other situations, but we'll get to that here in just a few moments. So, but let's just, for an example, take a couple different goods. First off, let's talk about gasoline. When I checked gas this week, it was about $2.49 a gallon, and let's say we were to apply a 10% increase to that. You buy gas at $2.49 a gallon this week. Fine, you're driving back and forth, getting your errands run, going to school, going to work, taking the little sister to soccer practice, what have you. But let's say you turn around and have a 10% increase the next day. It goes from $2.49 to $2.74. My suspicion, and I would normally in class I'd be asking people about this, but my suspicion is that in the immediate future, you're not going to do all that much changing in your driving habits, because although gas is a little bit more expensive, your responsibilities are still there. You still have to go to work. You still have to go to class. At least I hope you come to my class. Or you have to still take little sister to soccer practice in this particular example. And so the point here is that even though there is a increase in price, the amount of gas you're going to purchase in the immediate future is probably not going to change a whole lot. So it's relatively unresponsive. But then let's take another item. Let's talk about iPads. Now, I checked on the Apple website, and iPads, your basic ones, running about $329 each. And if there was a 10% shock in iPads, that would go from $329 to $362. I don't know about you guys, but I would turn around and say, no, wait a second. We just saw a 10%. We saw the price go up. I might be a little bit more inclined to try and make my laptop last a little bit longer if I could. Or I would say, well, maybe let me see if I can hold out for another week, see if the price will drop back down. Or I might be able to catch it on sale. The point is that iPads are a little bit more elastic. I'm a little bit more sensitive to changes in price to it relative to a similar increase in percent terms to the price of gasoline. And so that's what we're talking about here when we say elasticity. We're talking about the responsiveness and how much your purchase habits change when you see a shock in the price or a sudden change in price. And so this kind of goes back to our definition that we had before, that is the percent magnitude of responsiveness in quantity demanded or supplies when exposed to a shock in price. So what we see is that when there's a sudden change in price, how much does that impact our purchasing or production habits on the supply side? Now, we'll talk more about this here in a minute, but for the next hour or so, when we say elasticity, we're probably going to be talking about price elasticity of demand. There'll be some others, but this is what we'll focus on initially. All right, guys? So before we get to the math of it, I want to give you guys another example of how to think about this. What we have here is a little person stretching out a physical therapy elastic band. And what I want you to think about is that the length of the band itself represents quantity demanded, okay? So how far that band stretches is how much we demand of a given good. And how much you pull your arms represents the shock in price. So in this particular instance, the stronger pull, or the more, as you're pulling on your band, you're lowering the price, okay? So this fits in with the law of demand, as a lower price will cause a increase in the amount of quantity demanded. It should be pretty straightforward. But the point of this is that as you pull on the band, quantity demanded increases, but only so much. And when you take a similar pull and apply it to, say, a different band, one that's stiffer, if you apply the same kind of pressure in pulling it apart, a stiffer band will move less given the same force exerted. That's not as elastic. Or if you have a much lighter weight band, if you apply the same pressure in pulling it apart, it would actually move more. So that's even more elastic. You have a much greater responsiveness in quantity demanded to the same pull or change in price. And we've got some of those. I can actually show you this better in person. We'll do that at the start of the next class. So let's go ahead and get to the math of this. Math's not pretty, and it's not one of my favorite subjects or parts of this, but it's necessary to convey to you the truth behind elasticity. And you might be thinking, well, why is it important? Well, we'll cover that at the end of the lecture today. But as a given, let's just go ahead and start with this very basic demand schedule. Now, if you need to refer to this in your book, it does exist in your book. I'm pulling it straight out of just to make the math easy. It's table 6.1 on page 127 in your book. I've recreated the graph here a little bit, but this will give you an idea and let you pull in some other numbers and verify what's going on. So we've got a very basic demand schedule for movie tickets demanded. So as we have the price per quantity go down, the number of tickets demanded goes up. It's an exact inverse. Now let's go ahead and talk about putting the concept that we had into mathematical terms. So the elasticity of demand for a single good noted X, we're talking about the percent change, delta here. This triangle is the Greek letter delta, and it indicates change in, generally speaking, and it's not just in this class, but in a lot of classes and in mathematics, delta will indicate change in. So we're talking about a percent change in quantity demanded relative to or in response to a percent change in price. Now, we're putting percents here, and I want to talk about that for a second. The reason we use percents on this is that it levels the playing field, because we went back and let's just jump back real quick to our iPads and our gasoline. It's a 10% increase, but that's a difference of about a quarter versus $30+. And if we think about these things in absolute terms, it's largely different scopes, and will give us a very biased way of looking at the difference in responsiveness, because gasoline is relatively inelastic. You would have a small change, but it's also an incredibly small total amount. So we don't want to bias this by applying a different scope to each one. So that's why we put things in percent terms, is to kind of keep things on a level playing field. So again, we've got percent change in quantity demanded versus a percent change in price, and that's price per quantity, but we're just for short notation, we're denoting it price itself. Now, another way to write this, and to expand it a little bit, is that since we're looking at a change in quantity demanded, we're looking at a difference between two quantities here, Q0 and Q1. Q0 is your starting point, Q1 is where you finish at. And since we're putting this in percent terms, we have to divide by the original quantity that we started out with. It's in mathematical terms, we're normalizing the number. And down here in the denominator of the fraction, we're doing the exact same thing with price. P0 minus P1, your initial price versus where you shock or move to, and normalize or divide by your original state to put it in percent terms. By virtue of higher algebra, we can simply move the bottom of P0, since we're dividing here, to the top and multiply, and we can divide and put it in the bottom and multiply again. So Q0 minus Q1, P0 minus P1 times P over Q initial. It's the exact same formula in both these instances, it's just moved around algebraically. So let's take a look at, one last thing. The subscript here indicates a single good X. You will also be addressing this as the own price elasticity of demand. Since this is a single good, it's just X. We'll talk about cross prices later on, and that's where the subscript will become important. So let's go ahead and create an example, or do an example. Going back to our tickets demanded example from page 127 in your textbook, we are starting out right up here at the top. So let's say that we shock the price, we go from 8 to 7, and we can see that there is a change in quantity going from 1 to 2. So as the price goes down, the quantity demanded increases. Follows perfectly along. We have a downward sloping demand curve which follows the law of demand. So let's go ahead and plug in the numbers. We're moving down, and by plugging this into the equation, this is our result. We get a price elasticity of demand of -8. So what this tells us is that for every 1% change in price, we see a negative 8% change in quantity demanded. And that makes a lot of sense. So as we drop in price, we see a drop in quantity demanded, and this helps us. This actually quantifies how much how much that change will be. But there's a little bit of an issue. What if the direction changes? What if instead of going down, we go up? So let's see if we get the same thing. Starting from a lower initial point and going up from 7 to 8, and quantity decreases from 2 to 1. So if we plug that into our equation, just the same as before, but oh, wait a second. Oh, that's not right, is it? We've got an own price elasticity of negative 3.5. But we just saw that it was actually negative 8 here and negative 3.5 here. Well, this is kind of problematic then, isn't it? Because we're talking about the exact same range here between these 2 points. And we're talking about the exact same price schedule as before, the exact same curve that hasn't moved at all, but we're getting 2 different results. Well, I'm not going to try and yank your chain here. We actually saw this coming. And the reason for this is that algebra here, our algebraic equation, is trying to define what truly is a calculus problem. The exact point of elasticity is incredibly, incredibly small, and it changes at different points along the demand curve. In the real world, we'll talk about curves in their totality and get an average just to get an overall idea of what we're looking at across all possible combinations. But I'm not going to make you do calculus here. What we're instead going to do is we're going to estimate it at the midpoint between the 2 endpoints. This kind of gets around the problem of coming at it from a given direction, is that instead of saying from one point to one point, we take a look at it measured at the midpoint between those 2 points, and we do that by taking an average of the 2 quantities. So this is what's known as the midpoint price elasticity of demand formula. It's more or less exactly the same as we saw before, except when we have the original quantity down in the bottom, or the original price that we normalize by, because remember, when we go back here, let's go back to the original. We've got the original quantity down here to put it in percent terms, the original price down here to put it in percent terms as well. For the midpoint formula, instead of simply putting the original price, we take the average of the 2 points. So we add them together, divide by 2 in both instances. That measures it from the midpoint between the 2 endpoints. And what that allows us to do is to get the same result going from either direction. And it's a little bit different when you measure it that way. It ends up being between the 2, and it gives us a better idea of what the elasticity actually is. And so whenever I ask you to actually calculate elasticity, I'd like you to use this particular formula, because we don't have to worry about which way you're going to get an answer for it. And you can actually calculate this for that example we just gave. We're not going to do that here, but if you want to go ahead and do the math on it and tell me what that elasticity is in class on Tuesday, we'll add to your participation points for the semester. So heretofore, we've been talking about elasticity of demand, or own price elasticity of demand in complete terms. But as I said before, this also applies to supply. What we can talk about then is the elasticity of demand uses quantity demanded. Similarly, the elasticity of supply uses quantity supplied. So we've got the supply schedule, the relationship between price per quantity and quantity supplied. The elasticity supply is denoted ES as opposed to ED, or ES sub X for a single good. But the math is exactly the same. It's simply, instead of putting in quantity demanded here, you put in quantity supplied. That gives you ES sub X. Very straightforward. And what that describes then is the difference, or the relationship between quantity supplied and price, and talks about that relationship more generally. But I want to talk for a moment about signs. Because of the law of demand and because of the law of supply, which we didn't truly discuss, but it's the same thing as law of demand in reverse, price elasticity of demand, or own price elasticity of demand, is always negative. Own price elasticity of supply is always positive. The law of demand requires an inverse relationship between quantity demanded and price, and that simply means that, as we mentioned before, if we go back, that as price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. It's an inverse or downward sloping relationship. But when we talk about own price elasticity, they're generally given in absolute terms. So if we say that ED, and there could be a sub X here, of 0.63, what we really mean is negative 0.63, because own price elasticity of demand is understood to be negative because of the law of demand. If we're talking about ES sub X, 0.63 is actually 0.63. You would never have a cause to put a negative sign in front of it, so that's not really an issue. But if I put the own price elasticity of demand is 1.9, then it really means negative 1.9. So this is just a general convention. Own price elasticities are generally given in absolute terms. And just like there are determinants of supply and determinants of demand, there are determinants of elasticity. There are things which will cause a change in the way elasticity is not calculated, but how it looks, and what we can think about in the background of why an elasticity might be a certain way. So let's go ahead and talk about that for a second. Substitutability is a big one. The idea being that if there are more substitutes for the good or service you're purchasing, generally the more elastic it becomes. And this kind of makes sense, because as we're going with potato chips, if you could purchase corn chips instead, or peanut butter pretzels, or popcorn, or if we expand our idea of the market more broadly to salty, crunchy snacks, if you've got the ability to go between different options to fill the need that you have, chances are you're going to be more sensitive to changes in price. And this is generally pretty intuitive. The next one is proportion of income. So as the purchase puts a bigger ding in your wallet, the more cautious and more sensitive about the decision you'll become. Think about it this way. If you're buying a pencil, that is going to cost you, if you buy a pack of them, about a nickel for a single one, right? Maybe a little more to account for inflation. But now let's turn around and say, okay, now I'm going to buy a car. So 1% change in the price of the pencil, not going to bother you one way or the other. It's probably almost immeasurable. But a 1% change in the price of a car could be several $100s. And so that's going to be something that makes you a little bit more sensitive to whether or not you actually make the decision to purchase that. So as the purchase takes a larger proportion, not just larger total of income, but a larger proportion of your income, the elasticity tends to increase. And whether or not the good or product is, or good or service is, a luxury or a necessity has a big impact. Necessities tend to be more inelastic, luxuries tend to be more elastic. Now, when we say luxuries and necessities, there are economic reasons or economic definitions behind that, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. But right now, I want you to think about them simply in layman's terms. Of luxury is something that it's nice to have, but you don't really need it. Necessities are much more necessary for your given standard of living or the way that you live your day-to-day life. What constitutes a luxury versus necessity will actually change over time. And when you think about it, everybody's got a cell phone in their pocket now, but back in 1985, a cell phone was something that almost nobody had. It was only for the incredibly rich. I mean, they were charging like $5-10 a minute, and that I'm not sure about that number, but I know it was incredibly high. Whereas now, you can get an unlimited talk and text plan for about $30 a month if you go for someone that's not one of the big four providers, and it's use as much as you want. So what constitutes a luxury or what constitutes a necessity can change over time. But honestly, I want you to think about rent here, because while rent will take a very large chunk of your income, and that would say that elasticity could increase, it's also a necessity, so it would tend to be more inelastic. And so the luxury versus necessity argument may actually oppose substitutability and proportion of income. I mean, you can think about it another way. If rent goes up everywhere around you, are you going to move out? Or are you simply going to start giving up other things, other luxuries, in order to pay the increased rent that you're probably going to have because you're either locked into a contract for the short term, or everything else is going up around you and there's not really a lot better option. Speaking of being locked into a contract, time is a huge factor in determining elasticity, because the longer your time frame, the larger your time scope, the more elastic your decisions tend to be. Let's think about this. Let's go to another product. Let's talk about gas. I mentioned this before as a relatively inelastic product. So let's go ahead and talk about this in a time frame. Now, as far as short-term and long-term, those also have economic definitions, but we'll get to that later when we talk about firm production and consumer behavior. But for right now, what I want you to think about is that the short term is just a period where you're constrained, where something violates our previous assumptions. Like either remember, our assumptions are complete information, the ability to or relatively minor transaction costs, things like that. So the short term is a period in which one of those, or at least one of those, is violated. So let's talk about, let's put up a situation. So let's say you're driving down the road and your gas light comes on, and you're going to stop, and you see this place with gas on the side. It says about $2.49 a gallon. You're thinking, okay, well, I think I saw somewhere that I might be able to get it cheaper at the next place. So you keep on driving. But instead of it being cheaper, the next place you come across is more expensive. I'm sure there's lots of us that this has happened to. I know it's happened to me plenty of times. And so you're starting to get your relevant time frame shorter, because as you drive down the road, the amount of time you have to make a decision becomes less and less. So you keep going down the road, and the next place you come to, assuming you don't backtrack, is 10 cents more on top of that. So we've got a 25-cent difference. But at this point, you're about running on fumes. And so unless you want to either pull over, assuming you don't have AAA, or you want to turn around and push the car back to the first station where you get a lower per gas price, the chance is that you're probably just going to go ahead and stop, suck it up, and fill up the tank, or at least put in enough to let you get to another gas station with a cheaper price, assuming you want to go that route. But you've actually made that purchase decision for gas, even with the higher price per gallon that you're running into. And that's what I mean here, is that your time frame got shorter and shorter, and your decision became less and less responsive to price, because even though as you went down the road the price was going up, you still made the decision to purchase because you had the ability, your ability to make decisions was becoming shorter and shorter. Now flip that around. Increase the amount of gas you have to, say, about half a tank. You're thinking, okay, I might want to get gas. And you come across and we run into the same situation. The next gas station has higher price. The next one has even higher after that. But you've got enough of a buffer in place to where if you wanted to, you could turn around, go back to the first gas station and get the cheapest one. Your purchase decision is therefore much more elastic when you have a buffer in place or more time in which to make your decision. Indeed, I put down here gaslight on versus a better mileage car. If we expand the decision much more beyond that, what might actually happen is you go and create, or say you come across and expand your time frame to months instead of the next 10 minutes when your gas light comes on. If the gas price keeps going up, you might decide to invest in a better mileage car in order to take advantage or to attenuate the increases that you see in gas prices. And so as your time frame gets larger, you become much more responsive to changes in price. In fact, it could be that the increases in gas prices cause you to become more sensitive to other complementary markets like automobiles. Or you could go to other avenues. You could start taking the bus or riding a bike. The point of this is that as your time frame gets shorter, as your options become more limited, the less responsive to price you become. And time is very closely connected to substitutability and luxury versus necessity. In fact, all of these are really connected. It's just that they can move them in different ways depending on which one or all of these they're hitting on. So let's go ahead and throw some new terms out here. We've talked about elasticity in numerical terms. We've done the math on them. We've got the right formula. We've thought about what makes the elasticity of a given good or service more or less elastic. But what do we really mean by that? Well, in general terms, when we say a good or service is elastic, it means that it is relatively responsive to changes in price. In mathematical terms, it means that for every 1% change in price, you have a more than 1% change in quantity, either demanded or supplied. This also means that your own price elasticity of the good is greater than 1. Generally, durable goods such as furniture or vehicles, even some professional services like tax preparation, shoe shines, having your car washed for you as opposed to going out and doing it yourself. All these things tend to be more elastic, which means you tend to have a greater sensitivity to changes in price when you make your purchase decision. By the same token, inelastic means that quantity is relatively unresponsive to changes in price. So that means for a 1% change in price, there is a less than 1% change in quantity demanded or supplied. This means that the elasticity in absolute terms is between 1 and 0. Examples of this include gasoline, food, and aggregate. Now I say in aggregate because remember, if we go back to our terms from last week, aggregate means in total. Now while your mix within food may be very high in flux, a combination of elastic and inelastic things, in total food is generally inelastic, because even if the price of food goes up, you still got to eat. You may make changes in what you're actually purchasing, but as far as in a price per calorie basis, you still got to eat. On the flip side of that, it's inelastic on the other side too, because even if the price starts dropping and dropping and dropping, you might start purchasing more and more better quality food, but there's still an upper limit on how much you can eat in a given time frame. So in both directions, food is relatively inelastic. Healthcare tends to be inelastic too, but for a different set of reasons. I want you to sit there and think about that for a minute before I discuss it further. Just think about there and sit there and think why healthcare might be inelastic. Well, there's a couple different reasons for that. Generally, when it comes to healthcare, there are several different factors at work here. One is that oftentimes you don't know what the price is going to be when you actually make your purchase decision. So it kind of violates that whole complete information assumption we have. But even if you have that, a lot of times healthcare is inelastic because as soon as you get sick, you want to get better as quickly as possible. So you move towards a shorter time frame. If you've got a broken leg, it also could be something where your purchase decision is partially out of your hands. It could be that the ambulance says, okay, we're going to get you to a hospital, and here it's the nearest one. Here it is. Or if you're in healthcare, if you're unconscious and unable to speak, you're at that point you're completely unresponsive to price. You're not actually the one making the decision, even though you'll be on the hook for it later. So, but in total, healthcare becomes relatively inelastic. And you could also think of it in terms of when you are injured or sick, that there are relatively few substitutes. You can go to, depending on what time of day it is, you can go to the emergency room. You can go to an urgent care center. You can wait and go to your normal doctor the next day, or you can go to a walk-in clinic. But there are relatively few substitutes, and depending on the severity of the injury or illness, those substitutes may be even further reduced. I'm thinking then even other situations where, like, if you've got parents of a newborn, baby's first sniffle, off to the ER you go. Panicky new parents. It happens. I'm not knocking them. It's just a thing where they will tend to panic at the slightest sniffle. But because of all of this, healthcare tends to be less sensitive to changes in price. And finally, there's unit elasticity. That means that it is a one-for-one responsiveness metric for percent changes in price and quantity. So as for every 1% increase or decrease in price, you have a 1% decrease or increase in quantity demanded or supplied. And in mathematical terms, elasticity is exactly 1. Generally, this does not happen. It's a useful term insofar as it gives you a complete picture of what elasticity can be, but by itself it's not really useful. But it's there so you can get a whole idea. Beyond that, I'm not really concerned with it. So we've heard about what constitutes being elastic, we've heard about what constitutes being inelastic, and even our little friend unit elasticity. But what if we just kind of like throw caution to the wind and go as far as we can in either direction? Well, in absolute terms, elasticity is bounded by 0 and infinity. So it can be anywhere between those. Now, if something is perfectly elastic, it means that our elasticity is actually infinity. And so it looks like this. There is a completely flat line. One thing I want to point out here is that this shows demand here and the next one shows supply. This can be either a demand or a supply curve. The idea being that there is this flat line price threshold, and when we're below this price threshold, there is absolutely nothing produced, nothing purchased. As soon as you go above this threshold, every possible unit is either produced and or purchased. It is perfectly elastic. As soon as it crosses this magic threshold, bang, everything goes. And our demand or supply curve is a flat line parallel to the quantity axis. So intuitively, if a elasticity can be perfectly elastic, then naturally going the other direction there is perfectly inelastic. And since we said that elasticity is bound by 0 and infinity, this goes the opposite direction to elasticity equal to 0, or undefined. And it looks like this, where the first one was completely flat, this is completely vertical. The quantity demanded or supplied is the exact same regardless of what price we're throwing at it. It's a vertical line. Again, this says supply here, it could be demand or supply. Now note, neither of these cases say what quantity supplied or what quantity demanded will be, or in the case of perfectly elastic, what that particular price level is that we have, that's the threshold. Rather, it only states that here price has absolutely no effect on what level quantity is, and in the other instance price has complete control over what level quantity is. It's either all or nothing. Here, where it's perfectly inelastic, price has absolutely no control over what the quantity supplied or demanded is. Alright? So let's move on. We've talked about, and we've dealt with mainly so far, what we called own price elasticity. I mentioned before that the ED sub X would be important here soon, and when we talked about cross price. So the own price elasticity is responsive based on quantity based on the product service's own price. We talked about that before. But remember our determinants of supply and determinants of demand. The prices of related goods will cause shifts in our demand curve or our supply curve. And so implicitly, we can estimate the magnitude of that effect. And so implicitly, a cross-price elasticity exists between the price of other goods and the quantity demanded or supplied of the own good or the good of the market in question we're talking about. Let me say that again. Because the prices of related goods have a shifting effect on both the supply and demand of a given market, an own price elasticity, or excuse me, a cross price elasticity implicitly exists, and we can measure it. And that's using this particular equation. It should look very familiar. It's simply a modification of the midpoint formula elasticity equation we saw earlier. Instead, we're talking about this for a change in the quantity demanded or supplied of good X, our initial one, relative to a change in the price of good Y. So we plug in the numbers again here, same thing as before. What we have is a percent change in quantity demanded or supplied of good X relative to a percent change in the price of good Y. We said before that a single subscript X shows a single good, the own price elasticity. But now, since we're talking about a cross price, we use two subscripts, XY, to indicate the two separate goods. Alright? This is a cross price elasticity. Again, it's a fancy term, but it simply means that what kind of responsiveness do we have in the good we're thinking about relative to a change in price in the other good. Put it in terms in our prior example, we said that there would be an elasticity change or a change in the quantity demanded of potato chips based on a change in the price of corn chips. This will allow us to actually to estimate the magnitude of that effect. Now, when talking about cross-price elasticities, we're going to have to do a little bit of changing gear in the way we denote the magnitudes themselves. Just as before, the signs are dependent on whether or not we're discussing elasticity of supply or demand. Before, if we were talking about own price elasticity of supply, we could assume it was positive. If we were talking about own price elasticity of demand, we could assume it was negative. However, cross-price elasticities are not strictly positive or strictly negative, and so we cannot assume the sign in these. And these cross-price elasticities are not discussed in absolute terms. The sign is important because it denotes how the crossed product, the other good or service that we're talking about, moves with respect to, that's what WRT is, with respect to, the product in question. If the signs between the own price elasticity and the cross price elasticity match, the products are complements. If they move in the opposite direction, they indicate substitutes. Alright, let's go through an example on this, just to kind of bring it all together. Let's talk about our market. We're defining a market. We're talking about the local market for peanut butter in this month. I pulled up Food City's website the other day and took a look on it, and they're selling a 28-ounce jar of Jif peanut butter extra crunchy for $4.49. And if you prefer creamy, I'm sorry, I'm crunchy, and so that's what we're going to talk about. At the same time, they have a Welch's 30-ounce Concord grape jelly jar for $2.19. So we're really concerned about the market for peanut butter. We're going to be concerning ourselves with changes in the quantity of peanut butter purchased or sold. All right? And I'm making up these numbers to illustrate the point because I don't think Food City would be happy with me talking about their actual sales numbers publicly. But just for the sake of argument, Welch's price, or at the Welch's price of $2.19, Food City sold 400 jars of Jif and 200 jars of Welch's grape jelly. Makes a lot of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, doesn't it? And right there, I just gave you a hint as what we're going to see in the next slide. But let's say that they increase the price suddenly from $2.19 to $2.59. That's a 40-cent increase. And at that new price, they instead sold 350 jars of Jif and only 175 jars of jelly. Alright, so let's go ahead and run this through our equations. Before we talk about cross price, let's confirm the own price elasticity of our Welch's grape jelly. So EDX, we plug in our differences for the numbers between 200 and 180. That should be that's a typo in the slide. It should be 180. Wow, I forgot. I completely forgot to update this slide with the new information. That's okay. We'll go with the math here because I'm pretty sure that this is correct. Extra participation points if you go through and double check my math. So we run this through our equation and it gives us a own price elasticity of negative 0.63. I could put 0.63, but since we're talking about cross price, let's go ahead and be consistent. This fits with our earlier determination that food generally is inelastic. It's between 0 and 1 in absolute terms, and that makes a lot of sense. So let's go ahead and proceed then with the cross price elasticity. We don't have the own price of Jif, so we cannot say we can't do a own price determination on Jif at this point because we haven't shown a shock in that. But if we look at the cross price elasticity of Jif peanut butter relative to a change in the price of Welch's grape jelly, we go from 400 to 350, same price change here and here, and that gives us a cross price elasticity of Jif peanut butter relative to the grape jelly price of negative 0.80. It's a little bit more sensitive than the jelly's own price, but the point is that the own price of peanut butter, assuming if we were to assume that we had the own price for peanut butter there, following the law of demand, it should be negative. Since the cross price elasticity is also negative, they all move together. These two goods are complements. Alright? The own price demand is negative as expected. The cross price is also negative, which indicates that peanut butter and jelly are complements. If the cross price elasticity was positive and the own price elasticity was negative, since we're talking about demand, if you have a positive cross price elasticity of demand between two products, that means that they're substitutes. Okay? So I said before we would be talking mostly about price elasticity, and generally that's true. But there are other kinds of elasticities. The other most popular one is known as an income elasticity. And it's the exact same math. Generally we'll talk about income elasticity of demand. You don't hear this in regards to supply. And the reason that is that income is a shifter for demand. It is a demand determinant. But income is not a shifter or determinant of supply. So income elasticity of supply, while it could exist, really doesn't mean anything, because income is not a shifter, or it doesn't have an effect on the relationship between price and quantity supplied. Now there might be a complement or a similar one, a related one, insofar as looking at input prices or technology. But you could calculate that, and it might be useful, but it's very difficult to do so, because for input prices you'd have to have some kind of input price index, and that falls way outside the scope of this particular course. Suffice to say that income elasticity is always income elasticity of demand. It's the exact same math as we have for own price elasticity or cross price elasticity, the midpoint estimated formula. The simple difference is that it uses income instead of price, and it's noted ED sub I. That's an I. It's kind of hard to see in a non-serif font. But the question is, why is income elasticity important? Well, we talked earlier about, and remember our assumptions, that all goods we would be talking about would be normal goods. Generally, the income elasticity of demand will denote whether or not a good is normal or inferior. Now think about what we're talking about when we say income elasticity of demand in practical terms. We're saying how much quantity demanded will change in percent terms relative to a percent change in income. So, as income goes up, how much more or less do you purchase of a given good? A normal good, your income elasticity of demand is greater than zero. This makes sense because as your income goes up, you demand or you purchase more of the good. Most goods are normal, and even more so in aggregate. We talked about food before, how your mix of purchases will change. You might end up, as your income goes up, buying more steak and less ground beef or less chicken. But when you look at food in aggregate, even though it's relatively inelastic, even in income, it's still a normal good. As your income goes up, you demand more of it. By the same token, your inferior good shows that as your income goes up, you demand less of the good. Alright? I've got an example here of ramen noodles. Now, I'm not trying to knock anybody. If you like ramen noodles, fine, good on you. But when I was a student, I got really burned out on ramen noodles. I don't like them anymore. Heck, I won't even go to 210 Jack, that fancy ramen place. But as my income started going up, I started buying fewer and fewer ramen noodles. I didn't want them anymore. I started putting my money into other things like more meat, more fresh vegetables, more complex carbohydrates that didn't require being microwaved. And so that's what we consider to be an inferior good. As income goes up, you demand less of the good. There is the possibility of another type of good called a Giffen good, but that kind of falls outside the scope of this class. We're not going to worry about it here. But with regards to income elasticity, normal good has a positive income or a positive effect on quantity demanded. Inferior good has a negative effect on quantity demanded. Indeed, you could expand this even further and say something was highly income elastic or a normal highly elastic good, a normal inelastic good, in which your income elasticity demand falls between 0 and positive 1. So as income goes up, you'll buy a little bit more, but not much. Or as income goes up, you'll buy a whole lot more. You might even think like expensive cars, luxury goods. Whereas inferior goods, you could have a inelastic inferior good, where it's between 0 and negative 1, or a highly elastic inferior good between negative 1 and infinity. Those are all possible, but for our purposes, which side of 0 is going to be sufficient? So we've talked about all this. We've talked about elasticities, we've talked about price elasticities, and income elasticities, and cross-price elasticities, and all this stuff. But the ultimate question is, why is this important? Well, there are some real-world impacts of elasticity, particularly with regards to quantity demanded and supplied, out in the world. Crop forecasting is one thing. Now, I said before as an example, say you were a farmer and you were going to plant corn or soybeans. Well, elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand inform projections for the United States Department of Agriculture, and FAPRI is the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute out of the University of Missouri. And they will create models that will actually look into the future and say what they think is going to happen in the agricultural markets based on current assumptions and various possibilities of prices that they think might happen. And when they build these models, if the elasticities don't balance properly, then the models explode. And I worked with each of these groups for a number of years to see how they do this. I'm not going to show you how because it really goes outside the scope of this course. But what I mean to say is that elasticity has a very real impact on what information gets sent out to U.S. agricultural producers and tells them what should happen and how they should change their investments or how they should plant going forward in the future. As we said before, expectations will have shifting effects on supply and demand. Well, these reports that USDA and FAPRI come up with are those expectations. They inform what's going to come. And so if the numbers don't balance right, everything explodes and they get really bad data and everything is worse off for it. Fortunately, they're very good at their jobs. I've seen them do it. Taxation. I don't know about you guys, I don't like taxes. I find very few people relatively who actually would be willing to raise their hands and say, hey, I like paying taxes. Well, I don't. But regardless, taxes have an impact on prices. Taxes are very good examples of price shocks. And what happens is that governments will need to know how purchasing habits respond to price changes, not just purchasing, but production habits as well, because the taxes can be shared between the burden can be shared between prices or between producers and consumers, depending on the elasticities in place. But governments need to know how purchasing and production habits respond to price changes to set the proper tax rates. If they don't set them low, if they set them too low, they're missing out on income. If they set them too high, people actually start buying less in total, and they actually lose money on the deal that they might have gained earlier. That's a concept known as a Laffer curve, but we'll get to that much later. Regardless, governments have to know about elasticities to determine where they should set these shocks so that they don't cause everything to blow up. Finally, commodity trading. Now, I might be showing my age here, but I hope many of you have seen the old movie Trading Places with Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd. In that movie, both the main characters worked at different points for a commodity brokerage known as Duke and Duke. And those places actually exist in the real world. What these places do, they trade commodities such as gold, wheat, corn, soybeans, frozen concentrated orange juice was the big one in that particular movie, pork bellies. They will trade these commodities, and they'll use elasticity estimations to look ahead and see what will happen if changes occur in prices, which will then inform what price they should purchase at, and how much changes in quantity will occur. And so earlier I asked, what does this have to do with the price of tea of China? And the answer is everything. Elasticity is very important with regards to international goods trading. It will actually have a big impact on international trade if we get to that particular portion later in the semester. So that's about all I've got. There's no quiz this week. I've got one typed up if anybody wants to see some questions or what might be useful knowledge for other things that we would have covered response to last week, but there's not a whole lot more I have. Again, if there are any questions you have, please feel free to email me. You guys all have my email address. If you want some extra participation points, you can go through and fill out the rest of the math for the midpoint estimation in our tickets equation. If nothing else, we will meet again this coming Tuesday at our normal time, in which point we'll be covering consumer theory and marginality. And we've got a really neat demonstration as part of that. And again, if anybody has a severe allergy to chocolate, please let me know. It will be involved. So that's one of the things that makes it a good demonstration to have. So until next time, thank you very much, and we'll see you in class.